Forget the astronauts for a second. Forget the actual moon landing. Today in this explainer, we are diving deep into the unsung, frankly terrifying hero of the Apollo missions, the Saturn V. Look, this wasn't just a rocket. It was an impossibly powerful machine, teetering right on the absolute edge of physics. It was a beast of brute force and incredibly delicate engineering, walking a tightrope over catastrophe from the very second it left the assembly building. 3,000 tons. I really want you to let that number just crush you for a second. We're talking about 3,000 tons of metal, machinery, and highly volatile liquid. Imagine taking the weight of multiple Navy destroyers and packing all of that into one vertical column. This wasn't just a vehicle, it was literally a man-made mountain of pure potential energy. And here is the truly terrifying reality of it all. The Saturn V was essentially a 111-meter skyscraper, filled to the absolute brim with explosives. And by its very nature, it was constantly trying to destroy itself. Every single second of its existence was a brutal, high-stakes fight for survival against extreme physical forces that wanted nothing more than to rip it apart. So, let's get into Section 1, Moving the Land Leviathan. Before we even talk about space, we have to talk about moving this thing on its slow, agonizing 5-kilometer journey to the launch pad. Seriously, how do you move a 3,000-ton, incredibly top-heavy skyscraper up a 5% incline? Gravity wants absolutely nothing more than to pull this massive structure down and just tip it right into the Florida dirt. Even a microscopic lean across 111 meters creates a totally catastrophic shift in the center of gravity. Well, the answer was the crawler transporter. This lumbering 2,700-ton iron beast, whose entire purpose was to carry the 3,000-ton rocket on its back. So you've got nearly 6,000 tons of combined metal crawling across the Earth. But raw brute strength simply wasn't enough to survive that incline. They needed surgical, almost impossible precision. 1/6 of a degree. As this mountain of metal climbed the ramp, the crawler's massive hydraulics had to actively adjust the platform, keeping the rocket perfectly level to within 1/6 of a degree. To put that into perspective, that is the exact width of a thread on a basketball. If the hydraulics lagged, if that rocket tilted past that single thread margin of error, the entire skyscraper would crash to the ground before the countdown even began. Section 2, the threat of sound. So, the countdown hits 0, and immediately we face a weapon of our own making, a 220 decibel wall of acoustic energy. Now, at this volume, sound completely ceases to be something you just hear. It becomes a violent physical force capable of absolute destruction. Here's what happens. Those 220 decibel sound waves slam into the concrete launch pad, and they don't just dissipate, they reflect straight back up. Left unchecked, those invisible waves would literally shatter the rocket's skin and tear its internal components to shreds. So the solution? A massive 300,000-gallon water deluge flooding the pad in just 30 seconds. It acted like a giant acoustic sponge to absorb all that lethal kinetic energy, basically saving the rocket from its own roar. Moving on to Section 3, the volumetric burn rate. Okay, this is where the physics go from extreme to downright terrifying. We need to talk about the volumetric burn rate. Because to overcome Earth's gravity with something this huge, you can't just burn fuel. You have to absolutely annihilate it at a speed that completely defies logic. 7.5 million pounds of thrust. That is the raw, unadulterated power required to lift this Leviathan off the pad. It's a statistic so massive, our brains honestly struggle to comprehend the sheer violence detonating inside those 5 F1 engine bells just to generate it. To produce that mind-boggling thrust, the Saturn V had to violently consume 15 tons of propellant. And I don't mean per hour, I don't mean per minute, I mean 15 tons of highly explosive fuel every single second. Let's visualize that. Imagine a standard backyard swimming pool. Got it? Now picture a single F1 fuel pump. And remember, there were 5 of these. That single pump spun with such ferocious torque that if you hooked it up to that pool, it would suck the entire thing completely dry in under 30 seconds. That is the sheer volume of fluid being rammed into those combustion chambers. It is just unbelievable. All right, Section 4, Fire and Ice. That monstrous fuel consumption created a literal internal war within the rocket skeleton. On one side of a thin metal wall, you have hundreds of tons of liquid oxygen, deeply cooled to a cryogenic -183 degrees Celsius. But mere centimeters away, the combustion chamber is roaring at a white-hot 3,200 degrees. You have one of the coldest substances on Earth, separated from an inferno that can melt rock by just millimeters. This created a thermal shock so intense, the rocket actually shrank. Seriously, when they pumped in that freezing liquid oxygen, the intense cold forced the entire metal structure to physically contract. That 111-meter skyscraper literally lost centimeters in height right there on the launch pad. So how do you stop metal from just snapping under that kind of intense stress? Well, NASA integrated flexible expansion joints, which allowed the rocket to literally flex and shrink without breaking its spine. They also utilized specialized aluminum alloys that did the seemingly impossible. They actually became stronger and tougher at ultra-low temperatures, ensuring those freezing oxygen tanks wouldn't shatter like glass. Finally, Section 5, the rocket accordion. Okay, the launch pad is cleared, but as the rocket accelerates, it encounters the most terrifying anomaly of the entire flight. Imagine this insanely high-stakes scenario. How do you stop a 111-meter steel accordion from vibrating itself apart mid-flight? This was a lethal dynamic that threatened to completely end the mission before they even reached orbit. The engineers called it the pogo effect. Down in the engines, subtle fluctuations in thrust sent pressure waves surging up the incredibly long fuel pipes. The fuel inside began to vibrate rhythmically, and this birthed a catastrophic structural feedback loop. The engine pushed, the fuel bounced, and the entire massive rocket reacted. The result was unadulterated terror. The entire 111-meter structure began to rapidly stretch and compress, violently pumping up and down, exactly like a giant steel accordion. These longitudinal G-forces spiked rapidly. Left unchecked for even a few seconds, this feedback loop would shear the bolts, tear the bulkheads, and literally shake the rocket and the astronauts strapped to the very top to pieces. The solution to this monstrous problem was brilliantly simple. Engineers installed gas cushions inside the fuel lines, basically acting as shock absorbers for the fluid dynamics. When the thrust fluctuated, these cushions compressed, absorbing those deadly pressure waves and breaking the rhythm before that accordion effect could destroy the ship. It was an incredibly elegant fix that ultimately saved the crew's lives. From moving a top-heavy mountain on a basketball thread's margin of error, to surviving a shattering wall of sound, to taming a steel accordion burning 15 tons of fuel a second. When you look at the whole picture, knowing this thing was literally a skyscraper of explosives constantly on the brink of structural failure, how did humanity ever dare to light the fuse?